It's my pleasure to welcome you today for the talk being given to us by Mia Bloom. My name is Ruth Gibson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Health Policy and here at CSAC. I want to formally introduce you. Welcome back, first of all. Mia is an international security fellow at New America, and she's a professor at Georgia State University. She's the author of 6 books. Her most recent book, Veiled Threats, is being sold here today and has written over 80 articles on violent extremism. Mia actually speaks 8 languages, which I learned last night. We went out for dinner and the server did not understand my Canadian English, and she switched into Russian to help me out. She's a former term member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and has worked with Women Without Borders and multiple international groups on terrorism. So we're thrilled to have you back, Mia, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And I really thank Ruth and Harold for welcoming me back. And it was lovely seeing, I haven't seen Scott, and I think the last time was in San Francisco at Buca di Beppo. But I'm going to, you want me here, right? Okay. So first of all, just thank you all for coming. This is the thing that forwards it. One. Okay. Up or down? Okay. Let's try it this one. Okay. So I always have to do this disclaimer for the research because over the last 16 years, the Minerva Research Initiative has been extremely generous and given me 10 grants for like different Minerva projects. So during the Q&A, you can ask any questions about beyond the presentation. What I also always have to do is say that I don't represent the Department of the Navy or the DoD or Minerva Research Initiative, and any mistakes are my own. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking with the fellows tonight is in the current challenging landscape for funding, there are still opportunities and ways that you can, I don't know, make your research a little bit bespoke or tailored to the opportunities that do exist. And so I'm, again, I know it's very tough, but so that is what I wanted to say. And Minerva has been incredibly generous to me and a few people in the room. And I think that there will be funding again once the dust settles. But I'm gonna talk to the fellows tonight about ways of finding funding and keeping funding. Okay, these are the books. As you can tell, I like little article titles that are plays on words. So Dying to Kill because they die and they kill, or Bombshell because the women were generally attractive. Veiled Threats is in that same vein. So some of the recent articles, one of the articles I was very grateful to Kate for posting was looking at how the LGBT community has been targeted by all extremist groups. So it's the one thing that they can agree on, that they don't like the LGBT community. And I don't know if any of you guys have like one of those Google alerts on your name. I woke up last week to a Google alert that I was on Pornhub. And I was like, I don't remember doing any porn. So I made the mistake. I clicked the link, and what it was is because the lead author on the LGBT victimization piece in PS is in Adelaide, Australia, Jared DeMello. Adelaide pays for open access, which means that this has been covered by people who don't have university affiliations, and they can just read the article. And so it was in Pink News, and then apparently there are articles on Pornhub. I'm guessing the same way that we used to read the articles in Playboy, but apparently yes. So I'm not actually in Pornhub, but this article is. I was very excited about that. So if you haven't heard about QAnon, which again, that means you've been living under a rock, it's a baseless conspiracy that basically appeared initially on 4chan, then 8chan, then 8kun. But then it moved across different platforms. And so in my last book, I explained sort of how that movement occurred. But it argues that there is an elite group a cabal, or as our representative Marjorie Taylor Greene likes to call it, a cable, a cabal of powerful elites that are not only abusing children sexually, they are drinking their blood. And it sounds really crazy, except for the fact that if the surveys that have been done are representative samples, it could be as many as 30 million US adults believe in this conspiracy theory. And they believe that there is this cabal of elites. And again, part of it is they can point to a handful of examples, whether it's Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein or Woody Allen. Again, to quote Larry David, doesn't look good, but yes, there are exactly a few examples here. So QAnon went from being this fringe conspiracy on the chans to one that has been embraced by members of Congress, like Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And for those of you who are familiar with any history of anti-Semitism, a lot of these tropes originate in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And these conspiracies were driven by China and Russia on social media. And so that's how it moved from the Chans to the Coons to Facebook, Instagram, and to like your grandmother or your brother-in-law's feed. The reason I emphasize this is because the current priorities of the administration include looking at things like anti-Semitism. But for the longest time, the interest in QAnon was relatively flat. It emerges in October of 2017, and you see that it really wasn't that popular until COVID-19 lockdowns. And according to the Wall Street Journal, there was a 600% increase in posting about QAnon, sharing QAnon material. And again, it's highly correlated to the fact that people were on their computers more and that they were more susceptible. Now, initially, as I mentioned, it started on the Chans and it went to Reddit. Reddit, very early on in 2018, shut it down. And it made it more difficult for QAnon to have their threads. Regular social media, the people in this neighborhood, were a little bit slower in adopting their restrictions. And right before the 2020 election, QAnon content was shut down on most of the open API platforms like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. But as Frances Haugen explained in her testimony before Congress, those guardrails were eliminated after the election. And so there is a bit of a correlation between what happened on January 6th and the fact that the guardrails were taken off. The other thing that Frances Haugen explained was, you know, the chatbots, when left to their own devices, very quickly went down the rabbit holes. Most people were maybe 4 to 6 clicks away from QAnon content. So basically, that's the reason it became so popular, but it's also why, at least according to the surveys, it could be as many as 30 million adults. Now, when social media companies in Palo Alto and, you know, in this neighborhood, and maybe a few neighborhoods in Washington State, clamped down, one of the things that QAnon did was it used coded language. Now, this looked very similar to what had happened when ISIS was kicked off of most of the social media platforms in December of 2015, early 2016. ISIS stopped calling itself ISIS. You would have I5, or they would use different kinds of codes so that they could evade the AI search engines that was looking for ISIS content. QAnon used also coded language, but they used coded language not just because of the deplatforming, but some of the coded language was really crazy and incredibly offensive. Let me now just, the trigger warning for what I'm about to say. So for example, this is why when Hillary Clinton's emails became public, this idea of going for cheese pizza, for them, cheese pizza was a little girl, or pasta was a little boy. This one's my least favorite, walnut, we're children of color. So again, they assumed that because they were using coded language was being used by the people perpetrating these horrible acts of pedophilia. And QAnon, for the most part, has become a mass movement embedded within a political frame. And when they appeared October 2017, within a year, this is October 2018, you can see Governor Ron DeSantis, people holding up posters or wearing Q on their shirt. And it's very unlikely that President Trump was unaware of QAnon, despite, in the 2020 election, he said he had no idea who they were, but if they were against pedophilia, wasn't that a good thing? It was very clear, even if he wasn't cognizant of it, the people around him certainly were. And the way we know that it was really impactful was in the primary leading up to 2020. So in the summer of 2020, there were 97 QAnon supporting candidates. Now, in the orange are the states in which there were the most. California, Texas, and Florida, and this is adjusted for population size as well. So interestingly enough, from the primaries, there were only 24 congressional candidates, 22 were Republicans, 2 were independents, and only 2 in the 2020 election were elected in Colorado and in Georgia. So it's interesting that when you look at this, and one of my other Minerva projects was looking at insider threats in the US military, those 2 maps map on perfectly. So we do also have members of the US military that either have been exposed to or believe in QAnon conspiracy theory, which probably helped fuel some of that January 6th. We're not sure what to call that anymore, but the events of January 6th. But QAnon technically is bipartisan, while I think the vast majority, given the primary candidates, show that it was Republican. Its efficacy in embedding itself in left-wing spaces, like on Instagram for breastfeeding, chat groups or mom groups or natural childbirth, anti-vax. What we started to see, especially in the yoga community, was that yoga community became very anti-vax, with lots of people believing in QAnon. And so when we look at the Washington Post survey, which was the survey on American life coming from American Enterprises Institute, we see that 29% of the people who agreed with the statement, Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites. 29% of the people that said yes were Republican, but 6 identified as Democrats. And it's very likely when you scratch the surface, you're getting a lot of the Bernie bros. But again, my co-author on the book, who has degrees in mathematics and psychology, when this is translated as a representative sample, this could be as many as 30 million American adults. Now, starting in 2018, Christopher Wray, who is now the former director of the FBI, said that QAnon had the potential for terrorism, and not because they had engaged in terrorism. The vast majority of those early crimes, there were like 12 events between 2018 and 2020 involving QAnon. They were mostly women kidnapping their own child who had lost custody, or people harming their own children. So a lot of it was personal violence within the family. But what happened was, one of the threats was to the Hoover Dam. And now that became qualified as a potential threat to infrastructure, which was terrorism. But it wasn't just Christopher Wray and the FBI. You had Alejandro Mayorkas saying it. You also had Merrick Garland. DHS put out warnings. And so there was this view, oh my God, QAnon is the next terrorist group. That was something that Ali Soufan and the Soufan group published. And because Sofia Moskalenko and I are both interested in terrorism, as you could tell from all those funny titled books that I'd published previously, that's what got us interested. And that's where we jumped in to be like, well, we do know from January 1st of 2025 that belief in conspiracy theories can move from the online space to the real world. So there is the possibility of radicalization. But the short answer is QAnon a terrorist group? It is not. It lacks a hierarchical structure. There's no shared intentions. It's an a la carte ideology. What I mean by that is when you look at what QAnon believes in, what they've done, and the example I used in the last book was it's like which was published with Stanford University Press. It's like a sticky ball rolling down a hill, picking up various conspiracy theories. So it was very embracing of a variety of different viewpoints, but you could pick and choose. You could be like, yeah, I believe in the cabal, and I believe that the moon landing was staged, but I don't think the earth is flat. Most terrorist groups don't allow you to pick and choose. If you are an ISIS believer, you're not going to be like friendly towards the LGBT community because you know some really nice gay guys. So basically, it's an a la carte ideology that you could decide degrees of how much QAnonness you subscribe to. It was also too numerous to be a group. In other words, if it's millions of people, if it would be violent, then we would be in serious trouble. So that was one of the things that we did. We used Sofia Moskalenko's measurements. So she has these psychological tools to measure radicalization, but also like radicalization of thought versus radicalization of action. So we use the ARIS and RIS assessment tools for people who believed in QAnon. And this is where I got the 30 million. So it's not a terrorist group, but it's definitely a mental health emergency. One of the things, and again, this is a sad moment, Pyrus at University of Maryland, along with the START Center, has been defunded. So we don't know what's going to happen to the Pyrus data. If Stanford has a server, please contact Mike Jensen because he needs one. But what we have is the green shows the normal average psychopathy among American adults. The red is the Pyrus study of QAnon January 6th insurrectionists. And the blue are the case studies that we did of surveys for QAnon followers. And so we were pretty much in lockstep with Jensen's findings. But as you can see, it's significantly higher than sort of the baseline. And we actually published this in an op-ed, why QAnon followers are like opioid addicts and why that matters. Because treatment, sort of de-radicalization or treatment of people who hold radical ideas is very different than treatment of people who are either drug addicts or alcoholics or QAnon believers. So this is what we did. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with radicalization psychology, I will walk you through this, I promise. The idea is unfrozen social domains. These are strongly held beliefs that people have, and they've held it for a very long time. And I'll give you an example from, because we just did that LGBT article. Harold and I'm adding you in this. Harold and I are old enough that when we were younger, gender and sex were binaries, whereas now they are not. Now we have lots of different categories. We have people who are non-binary. We have people who are trans. So if you are of a certain age, your firmly held belief in sort of gender roles is shaken by the fact that we're in a very different world. And the joke that I used to make that only a half of you are going to get is, you know, back in the day, there were boys and girls. There was a section at the back of the Blockbuster. And now nobody knows what Blockbuster is, and they don't know what was behind the curtain. So that was really the joke for like 4 people in the room. But the other parts of it was firmly held beliefs in science. We've had major controversies with Big Pharma, with the Oxy, you know, the fact that the Sackler family basically hooked like a third of the Americans on a drug they knew would kill them, or the fact that there have been other debates about the viability. So science is no longer science. Environmental science is no longer science. So people, when the social domains are unfrozen, people become more susceptible either to radicalization, to bad ideas, to membership in extremist groups. And so what we have is inside the queue, the sticky ball includes everything from the cabal to, you know, flat earth, or that they believe in lizard people, that they really hate Tom Hanks and former Secretary Clinton, George Soros. And so you're looking at this and you're like, wait a second, I'm going to need to know more about the Tom Hanks. And it's because Tom Hanks was one of the first celebrities. I think he was in Australia at the time, came out and he had COVID. And because he admitted he had COVID, and then his son sort of started posting some crazy stuff. And so Tom Hanks is sort of one of the bad guys, which is funny because he never plays a bad guy. So what happens then is you are now susceptible, your domains are unfrozen, you're susceptible to these conspiracy ideas. And when you figure out what's going on, because the QAnon had gamified, so they said, do your own research, but they basically created the sequence that people would figure it out. People started to feel really good about themselves. There were the dopamine hits to the brain. They felt pride, like, I figured this out, I'm so clever. And it almost became like a proselytizing event. They had to tell everyone. And we saw this, for example, the QAnon individuals on January 6th. So, for example, this is Jake Angeli, the very famous QAnon shaman with the face paint. And anyways, I mean, I think I've even seen him on The Simpsons as a cartoon. This is an example from Arizona. And what we found was intersectionality. So people who were QAnon, who believed in this conspiracy theory, were also very often, they believed they were anti-vax or anti-mask, part of the open protests during the pandemic, part of the Stop the Steal after the election. And so if there was an intersection between sort of militia or KKK, right wing, neo Nazi, Aryan Nation, and QAnon, that's what made the people dangerous. But it was that other identity that made them a threat and not the QAnon. QAnon, like incels, if you've seen adolescents, are generally more dangerous to themselves. But if there's this intersection, and we see on Jake Angeli's chest exactly what I mean by that, he's telling you exactly, he's got all the right-wing tattoos. He's got Thor's hammer and the Tree of Life and all these Nordic tattoos that have become symbols for the far right. And going back to Jensen's research, we also know that 68% of the people who were arrested as part of January 6th had some sort of mental health concern, but also you can see that they had multiple movement affiliations. So our research validates the research of Jensen. The thing that became an issue and why we got a second grant on this to look at insider threats was on July 4th of 2020, Michael Flynn basically pledged allegiance to QAnon. So he did the Pledge of Allegiance, the normal one, and then he added where we go one, we go all. And so that basically raised sort of concerns about the military. But then, of course, Ashley Babbitt was the first person to be killed. And it was interesting because we were on all these platforms like Parlay. Initially on Parler or Parlay, they said, oh, no, she's Antifa. And it was only later that she became a martyr for the Trump cause. And he would bring her parents, her mother would come and talk at election events. And she, again, became one of the people that Trump talked about a lot, not just in 2020, but in 2024. So we have, again, if we compare QAnon offenders, this is from Pyrus, we see in terms of the violent versus non-violent, and then the intersection with military. Let me pivot for a second, because I know I'm going to be running out of time soon. Where does the LGBT stuff come in? Well, after the 2020 election, a lot of the conversations in the QAnon chats were about getting elected to school boards, starting, bottom up. They wanted to have more of a voice in what, children read. They became part of the book bans. And you can see this is, again, from them, where they have a kid on a pentagram, which is, Satanist, and they're like, let's learn critical race theory. And the one kid goes, I'm a gay communist now, which is basically an oxymoron because the communists were also very anti-LGBT. And these became cultural wedge issues that we saw play out in 2024. But before the election, in the confirmation hearing of Ketanji Brown Jackson, they were asking questions that would be like, how are you connecting these things? You're connecting these things because QAnon had connected them. And so some of the questions coming from, Josh Hawley and other Republican senators were clearly borrowed from this conversations that people were having among the QAnon. The other thing is leveraging this idea of moral panic. I'm going to say right now, if you thought that the green M&M looked more sexy in high heels, we should have a conversation about your addiction to chocolate. But as you may recall, there was crazy stuff on Fox News about Dr. Seuss or Mr. Potato Head. For QAnon, Hollywood is Petawood. And so you had Kid Rock, who apparently now is a presidential advisor, say Saturn's ring is the largest ring in the solar system, except for the Hollywood pedophile ring. So that's where they're looking at Hollywood, looking for this hints of pedophilia. So, for example, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Woody Allen, there's too many examples of men in Hollywood who abused their position, took advantage of women, took advantage of young women. But they would take images from like pride parades, regular pride parades, and turn it into evidence that, you know, LGBT were groomers. They were doing horrible things to the kids. And this is just a guy, this is his kid. He takes his kid to a parade. There's nothing nefarious about it, but they turned it into something. So one of the things that we did, Cody Buntain and I, is we looked at the Save the Children hashtag. There's an actual charity of Save the Children, and I'll show you the data in a second, but we compared them. But they would look at Walt Disney in the signature and look, 666. Like, this is crazy stuff. Or they would like point to the Sweet Love Life with Zach and Cody. It says Illuminate, but they would say Illuminati. And I'm like, I do not know why I know that that's a Sweet Life with Zach and Cody, and I'm embarrassed that I know that. But also, Goofy's skateboard has the eye of, you know, Eye of Horus. They would show images, and this is one of the things that inspired. So this is what I'm going to say to the fellows tonight. Sometimes, if you get an idea, run with it for the research. What we did was we looked at the series from the Save the Children to be like, we noticed that there's a pattern of this meme of a child with a hand covering its face. And when we looked at the Save the Children hashtag on Facebook and Instagram, and then we looked at the actual charity, what we noticed was a pretty distinct racial difference. For QAnon, they only showed white children, whereas Save the Children was overwhelmingly not white. And the only white children was because Save the Children had a small reading initiative during the pandemic in sort of some of the poorer southern states, and Jennifer Garner, because she's an ambassador. But for the most part, you know, images from Save the Children charity look like this. These are not the white children. But when we looked at the series from QAnon, and I should have had I wanted to cut down some of the slides, they were mostly white children with a brown or black hand over the mouth. And that's where we were like, wait a second, they're building on some of the tropes, the post-construction after the Civil War, Reconstruction tropes about the Black brute. And so that was intended to activate white suburban women to vote for Trump, to basically say, and he used it again in 2024, that Black and brown men are after your white children. In 2024, it was about the border, and it was about, was it Riley Haynes or something like that. Like, in other words, that's where they went. More recently, we saw, for example, this idea that QAnon is spreading this notion that Israel is responsible ultimately for 9/11 and for every bad thing that ever happened. When we look at the global spread of QAnon, we see it, despite the fact that it's at base racist, right? It has spread through Latin and South America. And one of the things we were looking at least in 2022, and I was working with Nelly Lahoud, and we were working in Arabic. We're like, why is the Middle East seemingly inoculated? Well, part of that had to do with the lack of freedom of speech. But we also see these are the same areas where we have threats of misinformation. In 2020, they brought back Pizzagate, despite the fact that even Edgar Welsh, when he was arrested, admitted there was no basement in Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. There was no Pizzagate. They're bringing it back. It was responsible in part for the failed coup in Germany in 2022. And what we're seeing now is a lot of similar tropes in current conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza. So, for example, this is in the LGBT article. For Russian disinformation, they've basically disseminated this idea that there were biolabs in Ukraine. So COVID-19 is not a Wuhan virus, it's a Ukrainian virus, but also that there were centers to create gay people. So conversion centers in Ukraine, when the Russians entered, were basically to make people gay, not to what they have in this country. I don't want to talk about this horrible thing, but also it wasn't just sort of random people. It was on Russian news. It was tweeted by the Russian embassy in the UK. And you can see the Russian bear, and on his chest it says Russia. It's the Eurozone, and there's the flag, the rainbow flag. My favorite is that they convinced people that they had trained mosquitoes to carry a virus that makes you gay. So they sold the mosquito repellent to prevent getting bitten by the gay mosquitoes. All right. So now what we have is a little controversial. I apologize, and I'm going to start speeding up a little bit. We have AI and disinformation with the current conflict with Israel and Hamas. The fact that there were images shared on social media were from Rauta in 2016, and this is Ilhan Omar's social media, retweeting this despite being checked by Twitter that this is not from Gaza, although I'll talk about that in a second. We've also seen, we did a project on poster defacing where we looked at the people who were tearing down the posters. And so we did 100 videos of people tearing down the posters. And then we did 2 different surveys of what people thought about poster defacing. And this is one of these things where, despite I was very pro Linda Sarsour prior to 2023, Sarsour had said, there are provocateurs across the city waiting for you to rip down their little posters. They have their little people around the city. They are everywhere. They are on your college campus. They are outside the supermarket. And she tweeted this. So we did the study, and what we found was the majority of people tearing down the posters were women. And then we looked at the gender, ethnicity, and demeanor. And so we got some really potentially controversial findings about not just that it was women, what kind of women. And what we found was exposure to conspiracy theories increases the radicalization, but under certain conditions may decrease your willingness to act. Now, these are people surveyed who believe in conspiracy theories, and sort of they were controlled for, did you know about QAnon? Did you know about QAnon? But not Russian disinformation about the gay mosquitoes. And we tested it across, for example, no, Israel did not bomb the Al-Ahli hospital. By the way, they did bomb it recently, but this I'm going back to originally in 2023. And no, Palestinians were not using babies, fake babies for dead babies, but lots of things have happened since. We've looked at these disinformation narratives using the radicalization scores to assess this. And then ultimately, we look at correlating it with precarious manhood or womanhood. And this is how it relates to the research we've done on incels. So you're going to often hear as a response, the 40 babies. There were not 40 babies. There was one baby. It was a baby. And in the infinite wisdom of Bibi Netanyahu, sarcasm, he posted the picture. I cleaned it up. And so we basically put it through. They're claiming it was AI. It's not. So one of the things that we've looked at is malign influence operations that are coming from our adversaries, Russia and China in particular. And I've worked with Kathleen Carley through Minerva to identify sort of doctored images, video trolls, deep fakes, fake personas. Since AI is one of the primary interests of the current administration, there is still funding for this kind of thing. So if there's any way you can relate your research to AI, that's one way. We looked at countermeasures, and we understood that it wasn't like yes or no binary. And I'll give you, because I'm running out of time, I'll give you a quick example. Christian Picciolini, he's a very famous ex-neo-Nazi. when he started having doubts about being a Nazi. He actually got more Nazi tattoos and he beat up more people of color or LGBT people because he was really afraid that his colleagues would figure out he was having doubts. So we can't just look at behavior to understand what people are thinking, but also it's a spectrum. People who are having doubts, some of those people may re-engage or some of those people may leave. And we had to come to terms with the fact that this is one of the things in the book where we suggest, how do you treat people? How do you get people out of QAnon? And arguing with them is definitely not the way. So Sophia, being a social and clinical psychologist, offers some ideas. But also there are going to be these in the red, the diehards. They are never going to leave, in the same way that there are people who are never going to believe that the 2020 election was fair, that there aren't, the cabal of people drinking blood to stay young. One of the things that happened was an influencer in the UK said, well, where did we get this where we go one, we go all business? That's their saying, right? WWG, one WGA. And so the response from an influencer in the UK was, on the boat, John F. Kennedy's boat, he had a bell. And the bell had engraved on it, where we go one, we go all. See, I can't prove to you that I'm not drinking blood to stay young, because those of you who've known me know I have not aged. But I can find a bell. So there's two John F. Kennedy boats. There's one parked outside UMass Boston. During the pandemic, I asked my colleague, Joe Brown, Joe, could you go see if there's a bell? And he goes and there was no bell. And because I'd done a lot of CNN, I knew that Kennedy, the family historian, and I asked as a favor, could you check the private Kennedy boat? And no bell. And so I found the image of the bell. And it actually goes back to a movie from 1988, that nobody saw. And that's where the bell is. So when I'm talking to a QAnon person, and I've done that, C-SPAN stuff, I'm like, go find the bell. Planting the seed of doubt is the way to go. So what's the conclusion? Why did you spend almost 40 minutes listening to my stuff? Basically, we know that extremist groups and foreign adversaries have encouraged belief in conspiracy theories to undermine faith in democracy and American institutions. And it's working. It's undermining faith in universities, in funding agencies, in NGOs, IOs. Meanwhile, the internet has made it easier for conspiracy theories to find each other, share information, recruit new believers. In an era dominated by pervasive influence of social media, the scholarly gaze often overlooks the ways far-right extremist groups leverage these platforms to propagate anti-democratic ideas. And then from the denial of the moon landing to calling 9/11 an inside job to QAnon, there's a myriad of other alt-right group conspiracy theories that are undermining our belief. And you only have to travel to Shasta County that they've eliminated their voting machines. That is basically QAnon. Let me stop here and say thank you so much for the extra few minutes.
Back down.
I can sit back down now. Good, because my legs stopped working halfway through.
So with that, thank you, Mia. We'll follow our normal protocol here, and we'll start with CSAC fellows, and then we'll open it up to the general audience and people online. We'll follow the order of, if you want to get on the queue, we'll use one finger, and if you want to jump the queue to follow up on something, we'll use two. And I welcome people on Zoom to send your questions in, and I will include you in the conversation. And if you can, when you begin, if you can please say your name and where you're from.
Knew nothing about the QAnon.
You're lucky,
honestly. Yeah, definitely not going to try to learn more. But I was interested on the countermeasures. So have you? Because I know you had a graph with or a map with different countries and their susceptibility. Do you think that's at all related to countries practicing different countermeasures? Because I know that on in terms of extremism, certain countries have adopted different ways of responding to it, like pretty drastically different compared to the US. European countries seem to be a lot better at it. If you've seen that, or
So, you know, there's been a lot, so since 9/11, so we've got 24 years. There was, before February 28th, a lot of money thrown at the issue. And this issue of de-radicalization has been really problematic. There's a wonderful piece, I think her name is Lydia Davis, in Hassan's journal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to Kate to make it available to you. It basically argued that there had been hundreds of millions of dollars wasted on this notion of de-radicalization. What I would say is changing people's hearts and minds is extremely difficult, but changing people's behavior is a little bit easier. And I think that the focus on de-radicalization was misapplied. It should have been on demobilization. Just so, in other words, anyone here can have horrible views about people of color, about Jews, about anyone, but just don't shoot anybody or blow anything up. Like, the idea is that, you know, your thoughts, we have a constitution. Again, I have to be careful how I phrase that now because things are getting interesting in a bad way. But changing people's thoughts is really, really challenging. So I think that the programs that were targeted towards changing behavior were more effective. The problem was they all showed 100% success rates and no recidivism, which, by the way, they wanted to keep their funding. Now, one of the programs I worked with, and when I was here the last time I talked about it, Sabaun in Pakistan, which basically took the kids, if they were under 15 and they were found in the terrorist training camps, they were like, we can save these kids. They're still salvageable. And what they did was they paired, you know, re-education and learning properly about Islam, that Islam didn't subscribe to these views of killing civilians. And they gave them training for different kinds of professions. And so all these things together to give these kids the possibility of a better life. And one of the kids excelled in school. They paid for him to go to medical school. Wonderful. But even they would admit that if a kid's family was still involved with the Haqqani network, they would pull them back in. And I think that that was the problem we saw in Saudi Arabia. That program there excluded if you were involved in radical work, then terrible. But they didn't have anyone who had killed anyone. So you're basically cutting off sort of the worst of the worst. And if you were going to go fight the Americans in Afghanistan or Iraq, or you were going to try to blow up something in Israel, well, that was okay. Well, that sort of defeats the purpose of de-radicalization. So I think that the programs themselves haven't been properly assessed. And some of the tools to assess them, like the VERA, which is the Violent Extremist Radicalization Assessment Tool, which, again, I love Elaine Pressman, but it's measuring religiosity and not radical views. And so the problem has been a lot of the quantitative approaches have been proxy measures. And we know that, you know, again, there have been perverse incentives for funding for the NGOs and the IOs, maybe to exaggerate the threat and then exaggerate the success. So the reason why the Arab countries had been mostly inoculated from QAnon wasn't anything that they were doing right. It's because they didn't allow free access to the internet and there was no freedom of speech. And they could arrest you for posting the wrong thing, as we have seen in Saudi Arabia and other countries. And apparently, depending on what your status, I'm a green card holder, so I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this. But yes, posting the wrong thing or publishing the wrong thing or being at the wrong demonstration now can be problematic. I'm cognizant of the fact that despite being here for a long time, I don't have the same rights. For example, I don't get to vote. I do get taxed, and so I often want to ask the IRS, can we talk about the tea? I have been taxed for a long time, and there's supposed to be no taxation without representation. Let me ask, there's another question. I'll end on a funny note. Fahad?
Hi, my name's Fahad. I'm a visiting scholar here. Thank you.
Where are you visiting from?
Tufts.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much. This was super, super interesting. I was just curious about whether there's maybe an economic insecurity dimension to this? If not, why not? Because I was struck by the sort of the unfreezing of the social domains that you had up there, and the sort of the feelings that they were producing, like fear and anxiety, and you can all see those kinds of maybe feelings of precarity also stemming from economic vulnerability.
So one of the things, when sometimes you go into a project and you have some preconceived notions, I was under the wrong impression that people that believed in QAnon would have to be not too bright because it's so crazy. And we found people with master's degree from Harvard University, or we found people who were doctors and lawyers, and like, in my view, people that should know better. And so we did not find sort of economic anxiety, much the same way that the reason the Save the Children hashtag was leveraging white fear of brown and black men had nothing to do with economics. We saw, for example, if you remember, there was a protest and people came out, I think it was in Ohio, with their guns, like serious, like we're talking automatic weapons. And there was no threat to their home. And that was a wealthy neighborhood. So I think what we're seeing is the anxiety at all levels. It's not correlated to economic status. What it is correlated to is that generally for the conspiracy theory to land, there has to be some element of truth. So, for example, every person probably believes in a conspiracy theory without realizing it's a conspiracy theory. I, for example, have been very suspicious about Lady Di's death for a long time. And again, if you watch The Crown, it's only validated. But like that, or whether there was a second shooter, the Kennedy assassination, when those files get opened up, we'll see whether, the trajectory of the bullets don't make turns, or like, in other words, people on the left have had conspiracy theories for a long time. We assume that conspiracy theories are affiliated with the right because the right has so many more. But we have conspiracy theory beliefs about GMOs. Some GMOs are very good. They have saved the mango production in certain parts of the world by, what is it called when you, with two roots, when you take the two roots and you grafting. Thank you. So that was a genetic modification as well, but they don't call grafting a GMO. So we have ideas about sort of what's good and what's bad, but I don't think it's correlated to wealth. I think wealth correlates to exposure to different ideas. And so that was one of the reasons when we wrote the book. You never have in an academic book the last chapter with like advice, like advice to people whose families or friends were in QAnon. And that was Sophia's idea. And we got a lot of thank you letters, including from Roseanne Boylan's family. Roseanne Boylan was the other woman killed on January 6th, who was a QAnon believer, that the president never mentions her. He only talks about Ashley Babbitt because the Boylan family blamed Trump for their daughter's death. So he never puts them on the stage. And most people don't even know her name. But like the Boylan family wrote to us and they're like, thank you so much for this. We wish we had known how to approach our daughter or our sister before. And part of it was also, if let's say I was going to disagree about nuclear weapons with Dr. Sagan, which by the way, I would never do. But let's say I would argue with him. It's very unlikely he would say, you're such an idiot. You just don't know what you're talking about. What he would probably do, because he's an amazing scholar, is he'd be like, well, here's how it breaks down. And so he would talk to me like an intelligent person, and I would probably respond better. If he just basically, gave me the Saturday Night Live equivalent of Jane, you ignorant slut, like that does not. So again, only half the people in the room get that.
Yes.
And that was not slut shaming. But anyways, this is again, not the way you would talk to them. So what we said was, don't argue with them. Basically say, find the area of convergence where, I agree. This is really bad that there are so many children, as many as 300,000 children a year are trafficked. And, most of those children are from the global South. And you give them one piece of information because they like to do their research, and they'll go and they'll find a bell or they'll find information, and that just plants the seeds of doubt. And then you just basically have to let the tree flower or the seed flower.
Scott wanted to jump in
Yes.
and respond
But
there.
just in the general queue, it's not a.
Oh, in the general.
Yeah,
queue.
it's not
Okay,
prepared.
Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I'm Anna Pearl. I'm also a postdoc here at CSAC. This was really interesting. So I work on questions of AI, and I feel
Oh,
like
okay.
we've seen this compounding so much with AI.
You'll still have a job. You're good.
Oh, great. That's good to hear. Thank you. But I was also wondering, because you said like so much plays out on social media now, it's compounded by AI. There's so like few regulations in place now, even more so than before. Like content moderations have been cut down. It's, you know, like kind of like almost becoming political mainstream. Like what are things that should or have to happen on a more like structural or political level to counter these trends?
I mean, part of the problem with the AI, okay, so I was telling the story to one of the other CSAC scholars who I know from San Diego a long time, because I'm friends with Eric Artsky. Tristan Harris puts up a slide that says 50% of AI researchers say that if we don't solve the AI problem, it will destroy the world. Now, I'm a qual girl, for those of you who know me, and I'm like, I'm gonna need to see the math. That's not something I often say. So what was Harris? So I wrote to Tristan Harris's Institute, ask us a question, automatic, we don't answer questions. So I tweeted about it, they answered the question. So where did they get this data point that 50% of AI research say that there's at least a 20% chance that if we don't solve AI, we will destroy the world, like Skynet or something? Well, they surveyed a conference on AI, everyone who attended, everyone from the book, you know, the people who are in the book room, to the grad students, to the senior scholars. There was a 17% respondent rate. So we're looking at 700 people and 50%. So basically 349 people said that there was a small chance, 20% chance of destroying the world. Now, if I had said there's 349 AI researchers that say that there's a small chance, you'd be like, eh. But if I say 50% of AI researchers believe, and he used this slide to brief the Congress, the Senate, and President Biden. Sorry, I was about to say the president, different president. And again, it's like what we call mathiness. There's this idea, like we know from AI that there is embedded within AI racial biases. And that's where I think like we need, it's not that AI is going to destroy the world. It's that, you know, self-driving cars, if they're not trained, you know, with a training set that include people of color, will run them over in the crosswalk, which is what happened. So I think that what we need to do is we need to sort of approach AI not because we've seen the Terminator and too many science fiction. And I think that there's you've probably seen it, but if you haven't and you're interested, there's a monk debate that with Jan LeCun and Bengio that basically destroys this idea that AI is going to destroy the world. But it's an amazing way, like like when you look at Jeffrey Hinton saying it's going to destroy the world, and then Jan LeCun, who shared the same prize, saying no, it's not. I think it's not that clear. And my worry is that it's almost like the United States learned nothing from 9/11. Like the way we responded to 9/11 was an over response and has really done some damage to institutions. And I worry that AI, we're going to see the same thing.
What we're going to do, do you need to follow up, Anna?
Yeah, I was just wondering then, like, how is, you know, what we're seeing now with QAnon specifically different from conspiracy theories or propaganda that we've seen before? Like,
So,
is it the like social media AI element?
So it's definitely social media that spreads it faster. I mean, there's been conspiracy theories forever. And what QAnon did was it had a very embracing approach to include conspiracy theories like, you know, that the earth is flat, that the moon landing was fake, 9/11 was an inside job, lizard people. These things are from the 90s and earlier. Well, you know, 9/11, not from the 90s. But so I think that that's what made it different, was that it allowed for, it was a bigger tent. And then AI allows it because of these echo chambers. The AI that is in the, you know, YouTube or in the social media that after you've watched one video about a conspiracy theory, it keeps offering you up more and more because the idea is to retain your attention. And the joke is if you're not paying for it, you are the product. So that's where the AI comes in. So, and I think that in future we may see where like they're going to have like the insider files from the Jeffrey Epstein Island, and they can create an entirely fake AI video and people will believe it. So it can be mediated, but I think that conspiracy theories existed far before.
Harold?
Thanks. Thanks, Mia, for super interesting talk. Sorry, my voice is still pretty weak, which is why I'm sharing today. Mia, can you talk about the role of social norms in limiting sort of acting on sort of radicalized ideas and behavior? Because you kind of hinted at this in an earlier answer where you said people believe all kinds of crazy things. The thing is to get them not to act on them. It strikes me that what's happened with the internet and social media is it provided spaces for people to act badly and get away with it. I wonder if you're seeing that kind of behavior online translate into sort of bad behavior in real life, so to speak.
So part of it is, people posting horrible things still technically within constitutional rights of the First Amendment. What I mean from that is people go from this like posting lots of horrible things to action. That base rate, according to Mark Sageman, is less than 0.005%. Now, what's happened for the longest time is we don't have a lot of crazy, radical, militant individuals. I was going to make an encampment joke, but not going to do it. But they were using posting as a proxy measure for radical. But radical intent and radical action are two very different things. So, for example, Max Taylor used to write about pornography, that some people who consume child pornography are never going to ever touch a child. And that psychologically, the consumption of that child pornography might be a way to kind of get it out of the system, literally. And never, but like, so I think that we've never actually, that's the $64,000 question, that how do we go from what people do online to what people do in real life? The number of people who actually do stuff is very small, unless, as I said, you have that intersectionality of you are a militiaman, or you're KKK, or you're Aryan Nation, or Identity Uvrapa, one of those groups, that the QAnon stuff will be like, you have to do this, and you have to do this now, and you have a limited time to react. And so that's where it gets really, problematic. But ultimately, the biggest danger QAnon poses is to our institutions. And we've seen how it's eroded people's faith in democracy or in election results. If the election result is not the one you like, then all of a sudden now you challenge those, and it can be overwhelming, and you're still challenging it. And what we found was with the QAnon, a lot of the tropes, either about elections or about lizard people or about adrenochrome. Adrenochrome actually is a real substance. It's in the EpiPen. You don't need to rape a child and kill it and drink its blood to get you just EpiPen. I mean, presuming it's not $3,000 per EpiPen. But the separate thing was, it comes from, as a narcotic, it comes from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It comes from a book and a movie. And then so much of the other tropes. So the fact that they call Hollywood Pettywood is so interesting, because so much of what they believe, came from Hollywood, including the bell. Like the bell is, for me, my favorite example. I think that we have to allow people to have terrible ideas. But if people are starting to ask Google, because Moonshot CVE does this, they have a relationship with Google where people are like, how do I kill a person of color? They don't say person of color, but I'm cleaning it up. How do I kill? Where do I find the AR-15? So it's not generally one question to the AI. Like the AI, if I want to say, how do I build a nuclear bomb? Google will tell me how to build. I don't need the AI for that. But it's a series of questions in a certain sequence that ultimately would be more dangerous. And so that's what we have to do. So Moonshot, for example, has these off ramps. So the person Googling, how do I kill the person of color, all of a sudden gets here's a suggestion for something that has nothing to do with killing, but is more likely, to take them away from their plans. The other thing, and this is again, according to Sophia, she's a psychologist, going outside for 20 minutes, just leaving the platform, whether it's on your phone or your laptop or your iPad, go outside for a walk 20 minutes. That has a greater effect on de-radicalization and demobilization than almost any program or series of lectures.
I want to take a couple of questions from our online audience. and if
How are
have
we
it
doing on
at
time?
12:15,
Okay, good.
is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, 1:15, sorry. So a number of the online members of our audience have shared that this is an enlightening presentation, thank you. But they're struggling to understand how these people get brainwashed in the first place, because one of their guests shared that they believe that these theories are very believable. And could you please elaborate further on how to, and the quote was, detoxify believers?
So one of the things, we did the C-SPAN. If you've ever done a C-SPAN for a book, many of you I'm sure have, they have like one line for independents, one line for Democrats, one line for Republicans. They added one line for QAnon. So they had the QAnon people calling. And, one of the things I did was to talk to them intelligently and basically not say you're an idiot. It becomes very easy to believe things when you're in echo chambers. I'll give you, for example, if you watch Bill Maher. Bill Maher apparently went and he flew to the White House and he had dinner with President Trump. And he said, that's not the guy I see in public. The person I spoke to laughed, made jokes. Like I've heard Bill Maher say for years, he's never seen President Trump laugh. And he's like, so I think what happens is we can very easily get into our own echo chambers about what's good and what's bad, who's good and who's bad. And so it becomes believable if we get a piece of information that contradicts what we think we believe. As scholars, it is really our responsibility to adjust our beliefs. What we don't do, what we should never do, is then massage whatever new data to basically, or data point to be like, well, that contradicts. And I remember when I wrote Veiled Threats, I partly wrote it as a corrective to my first book, Dying to Kill, about women. And Johann said to me, that's a very strange thing to do, to admit that you made mistakes. And I was like, I wrote a whole book to admit that I made mistakes. I think as scholars, that's what we do. Some of the stuff is believable, some of the stuff is not believable. And so that's why in the book, in the last chapter, you get to someone who, and again, brainwash is no one in psychology believes brainwash is a thing, but it's persuasion, or you get to the point where, well, I agree with you on this, this, and this, and I disagree with you on this one point. And then that's how you plant the seed. But it's not a fact. People did not believe in QAnon quickly. They're not going to stop believing in conspiracy quickly. You have to do it as a slow, measured response where you find areas of convergence. There's a conspiracy expert, Mick West, and he talks about this in his work. Find the areas where you still have common belief and work on building trust on those things, and then move. So I have very good friends who are evangelical Trump supporters, and we have conversations, and they had no idea that there were some states where a woman could not terminate an ectopic pregnancy. And just that one piece of information, these are people who are completely against, I call it choice, they call it abortion, but they're like, oh, wait, but we don't want the woman to die. So like, there are ways to talk to people. And I think that that's ultimately the best solution. And I think we have so much polarization currently in the country. It's very easy to ignore 50 or 49% of the country and dismiss them. But I don't think that that's the way to move forward. The way to move forward is to engage them respectfully, kindly, and hopefully if you're respectful, they will also be respectful. And then find the areas that you agree so that you can create this much smaller areas in which you disagree.
Okay, I just want to respond to the online audience and we'll come back to the main one. You're getting a lot of questions about specific recommendations for how to help people. And I heard you say that in your book, in the last chapter, you make advice for family members who are dealing with this.
We
And how-
do. So
okay.
what it was is in the last chapter is sort of like, you know, FAQs you get, but because it's QAnon, we do FAQs. And I apologize. I know I sound like Bob Pape. It's in chapter 4. No, I apologize. It
But
was
a lot of
always
the online
a
audience wants
response.
to know this.
It's in chapter 6 of the book. It's the last chapter. And what it is you ask the person a series of questions for which you already have the answer. And that helps plant the seed of doubt. And so we have a series of questions that you say, oh, you know, well, what do you think about X? And they'll give you their rhetoric and you have like a different response, or in all likelihood, they won't know the answer. And then you have a response.
Okay, I think that handles a number.
And I apologize again, like I'm making fun of Bob, but we're actually friends, which most people find surprising because I think it's important when you disagree with people to share ideas. And this is the best place in the world to do that.
We'll come back to you, Scott.
I very much appreciated your slide on Ashley Babbitt, such a disturbing case. You didn't mention that she was a nuclear power plant guard prior to
And a veteran of 3 tours.
and a veteran of 3 tours as a guard. It's an Air Force security guard. Leads me to 2 questions. One, do we know when she got converted to QAnon or became a believer? And second, are there tropes about nuclear power, nuclear weapons in that community, as there are all these other tropes that are bizarre? What does QAnon literature tell us about that?
You know, it's interesting because we should have had this conversation earlier. To the best of my knowledge, I think that the QAnon people do subscribe to this idea that, you know, the cabal is working towards the end of the world, but I
Right.
don't know if it's mediated by CBRN, which of the letters, you know, is it chemical, biological? A lot of it is when they're talking more about the biological and chemical sort of fluoride in the water or something like that. I don't recall anything specific to nuclear, but also I wasn't looking for it. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to get back to you on the nuclear. As far as Ashley Babbitt was concerned, you know, one of the things we've said is people, you know, going down the rabbit hole. I sometimes do that, you know, like I'll be on a social media platform and I want to see the answers and I want to see the conversation. And more recently, I'm ended up with just a lot of porn. And I'm like, I'm not sure how that happens, but apparently that is now quite common. But I can understand, like, because I don't do it, but I can understand the people who spend hours on Facebook, get their information only from Facebook. And I think ultimately, until Article 230 is addressed, we are always going to have the problem. I understand and appreciate the fact that there is a First Amendment, but as constitutional lawyers will tell you, even the First Amendment, you can't yell fire, fire in the movie theater. You've heard that, unless there's actually a fire. Facebook and social media are private companies. They are not required to uphold the First Amendment the way government agencies are. And we're seeing even government agencies now are, you know, determining what is permissible and not so permissible. So I think that the social media companies, it's going to be incumbent on them. We know from Frances Haugen, they can turn it off and they can turn it on. And that's what they did in 2020. When I saw before the election, the social media giants giving millions of dollars to the Harris campaign, and then after the election, going on bended knee, I realized that it's very unlikely that we're going to see the change, at least in the next 4 years. But I worry that something will happen and it flips the switch. And that's always how this country reacts, right? You know, something all of a sudden comes out of the blue and then everything is changed. I still want to think more about the nuclear weapons conversation because I want to see what QAnon says about like Nagasaki. Like, what are they saying about World War II? Because, you know, there's this great line from Benjamin Franklin. You can have a successful conspiracy among 3 people if 2 of them are dead. Like the idea is that you don't have operational secrecy. And so there would be leakage. We know that. How do we know about leakage? When you have lone actors, I hate the word lone wolf, but lone actor terrorists or mass casualty shooters, they always tell either a friend or a family member or someone elements of the plot. It's something like across all the different groups, it's like 77%. And so leakage is normal because we have a tendency as humans. We like to tell stories. We like to brag. We like to let me tell you, what is it now the kids say? Let me give you the tea. But that's why it's so unbelievable. And the whole idea of conspiracy theories itself is that they are innately contradictory, right? Because how do you have both, for example, that COVID-19 didn't exist, but it was created in a lab? No, it wasn't created in a lab. It was created in a biolab in Ukraine. Like it keeps changing. And so I think that part of it is those conversations. But you've asked me it's rare. You've asked me a question I don't have a good answer to, so I'm going to make sure I get one.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alana Resnick. I'm a visiting scholar. I'm an anthropologist at UC Santa Barbara. And something I was thinking about when
Best place in the world.
it's very nice.
Mark Juergensmeyer is one of my mentors. I love Santa Barbara.
Well, you should come visit. All right, we'll work on that. So I'm wondering, when you give this example of Israel bombing the hospital, you're like, well, it didn't happen, but then it happened. There's something about the conspiracy that's not about whether or not it happened, but also about the shifting realms of possibility, right? Because what happens when what you say didn't happen then becomes the reality? It reshifts and recalibrates, I would imagine, what the ground is in terms of.
Absolutely.
And so I'm wondering, how you see that with even what's happening now politically, when literally the shifting ground of what is possible has totally kind of fallen out from under us.
The thing that reminded me was the Al-Ahli, and I only found out about it was bombed recently I was on Twitter. So when I say recently, I'm talking within the last week. But it did not happen the way it was reported, and people rushed to report, and now people are sort of backtracking from the Gaza Ministry of Health because their numbers, it's amazing that not one fighter was killed when they talk about the numbers. And I used to joke with when they were talking about ISIS, and I was like, oh, I'm so grateful to the ISIS women for getting pregnant in such round numbers. Like when you see a number like that, it's a fake number. If I give you a number 271, that's more believable than 300 or 250. Yes. And it's this rounding error. Let's talk about Dan Ariely at dinner. But it's the rounding errors that we tend to do as humans. But I think it reminded me of, and again, I don't know if any of you guys are married, so bear with me. A wife accuses her husband of cheating. I know you're cheating. You're cheating. I know you're cheating. And the man at some point is going to be like, I'm already been accused. I might as well do it. So I think that the shifting norm happens. And this goes back to Harold's question about norms. I think that there are shifting norms that protecting the hostages, and then they shot Hirsch in the head, and people were like, there's nothing we can do. And then yesterday, Hamas turned down, I guess, what is sort of the most recent deal. And the reaction is, we've lost all these people, we've lost the hostages, we've lost the soldiers, the IDF soldiers have gone in. And then the end result, we still don't have them back. And they're recalcitrant, they're not willing to negotiate. The reaction is, we should have just done what President Trump said, flatten it and build a new Riviera. Like it's the problem is, I don't think people on the Israeli side, they do not appreciate the level of trauma, multi-generational trauma for Palestinians. And on the other side, people don't appreciate that October 7th was a completely changing world event. The idea of Israel being defensible, the idea that the Mossad is the best agency in the world, the idea that the IDF is the best trained military, the idea that most of those people who were killed in the area in particular were lefties who had been like driving children to the hospital, like all of those norms. And I see it also within sort of our own networks of people, can I quote Amy Schumer, but like the idea that people felt very abandoned and betrayed by the reaction. Now, I'm not talking about once Israel started bombing, but there was a period of time, maybe 4 days, 5 days, where we were waiting for the women's organizations to come forward and be like, we think rape is wrong. And instead, many of them were like, rape is resistance. And for someone like me who studies, that's in the book, right? The new book is looking at rape and war. We were like, wait a second. No one ever asked the Rwandan women to prove it, the Bosnian women to prove it. Like, and just the whole norm changed. And so this is where, this is where the subject matter gets really touchy, right? It's to try to acknowledge that there's no good outcome and there's no good guys in this conflict, and that we end up with, you know, Hamas bad guys, Bibi bad guy, and worse than Bibi. You know, we have the far right extremists who are also anti-LGBT and anti-woman. So like, we're used to, you know, in the Western, the guys with the white hats and the guys with the black hats. If everybody's wearing a black hat, it's really hard to know what the solution is. And I worry that given the reaction among the left, that is sort of what fractured. You know, that's part of the reason when people say, you know, how did this happen? How did we get to where we are politically? I think that the left's reaction was part of it. And to be honest, that's why we wrote the article about the LGBT. We wanted the LGBT community to know, you know, I know Gays for Gaza sounds, you know, something crazy. This is why it's crazy. And we didn't actually think it would get published, despite, I mean, it was a special issue for Ken Sherrill. Ken Sherrill was a dear friend of mine for 30 years, but we didn't think that we would get published because it was very politically incorrect. And the findings for who's tearing down the posters, we don't know who's going to publish that. Because again, so as an anthropologist, you know, a deep respect.
Maybe
But-
just one more minute.
Oh, sorry, I have to finish up.
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer.
So I think we're at the end of our time, and I know that Mia is happy to be willing to stay for a couple more minutes. And for the people online who ask questions, I have recorded your questions, and Mia will answer them, not the anonymous ones, but I think I've merged those together. The individual people who've asked online questions, we have those captured. And for our audience here, thank you for coming. And Mia will stay a little bit longer now. Thank you, Mia.
Yeah.